This is Writing It, the podcast about academics and writing. I'm Rachel Gordon. Here we aim to make the process of writing and publishing a bit more transparent and a bit less overwhelming. Through conversations with editors and academics at all stages, from full professors to graduate students, independent scholars, and postdocs, we share stories, lessons, and helpful habits from our writing lives. Today, we're speaking with Martin Siegel, who is the author of the recent book, Judgement and Mercy, the Turbulent Life and Times of the Judge Who Condemned the Rosenbergs. And Martin Siegel clerked for Judge Kaufman on the Second Circuit after graduating from Harvard Law School. He then served as an assistant U.S. attorney in the Southern District of New York and a staffer on the U.S. Senate Judiciary Committee. He now practices law in Houston and teaches American legal history at the University of Houston Law Center, where he also directs the Appellate Civil Rights Clinic. So your biography was published by Three Hills imprint of Cornell University Press, and I have to admit that's part of what caught my eye. This is a really great biography, and it is written in a very page-turning way. So our listeners can definitely feel free to suggest it to non-academic friends who are interested in American history and biography and the Cold War. It reads very well. And Cornell's books are beautiful, and they do great history and biography. But you are perhaps someone who doesn't need an academic press in the way that some tenure-track folks do. And so I'm curious, what made you choose this route of the trade division of an academic press for your book?
Sure. Well, I started out I began, I guess step one was trying to find an agent. So the goal was to publish with a trade press, if that's the right phrase, commercial press. And, knowing not a great deal about the process, although my wife had published a book a couple of years earlier with Oxford University Press. I knew a little bit about it from her, but otherwise I didn't know much about the publishing world. I learned that step one is to get an agent, and you can't really approach commercial presses without one. So I tried to do that, and did end up with an agent at the end of a kind of long process. That agent failed to place it at a commercial press. And so it seemed like the alternative, therefore, the way to get it published was through an academic press. And I had felt like the subject matter all along, might be eligible for a trade press. And as you pointed out, I wrote it in a way that I hoped would appeal to non-academic readers and even to non-lawyer readers, even though it's a biography of a judge. But on the other hand, I understood also that it would be appropriate for an academic press, or I thought it would. So that's how I landed beginning to investigate academic presses. And this was an arena I really knew, nothing about. I mean, I had read that sort of how you go about trying to get an agent and approach commercial presses. I knew, again, just from more reading, that you didn't need an agent to try to place a book with an academic press. But I think, as you pointed out, I was a sort of unusual, character for academic presses because I'm not a full-time academic. And so I wondered if that might impede my ability to place it with a university press. So I then just began looking for appropriate university presses, presses that published in this area, that focused on history and biography, that had a history of publishing, legal related titles. There's a lot of Jewish content in this book. So I was looking at presses that also have Jewish studies, lines of books. So that's how I wound up with Cornell. Cornell, the specific thing I think that attracted me to Cornell, aside from, you mentioned they publish history and biography. So I noticed that. And I also noticed they published some in the space of, Jewish history. But they have a particular imprint that's focused on New York related history. And that's where I ended up publishing. That's what Three Hills is. It is a trade-like sort of line for them. But it's focused on New York, and not just history, but also fiction and photography. There's a pretty wide range of New York related topics that they publish. And, I went sort of down the road with a few other academic presses that also had appropriate kind of histories of publishing that fit this book. But I settled on Cornell ultimately because that just seemed like a really great fit.
Yeah. So I'm assuming you got the readers' reports experience too. Is that part of?
Yeah. It was. Again, like that was all new to me. I mean, I had no idea that they in essence, almost farm out, if that's the right way to put it, the decision, or at least the approval, some level of approval, to these outside experts who aren't affiliated with the university necessarily. They're just subject matter experts. So yeah, I learned that was going to be necessary and had to wade through that, and was eventually, I don't know if this is common or not, but I got those reports. I assume that's standard. And, which gave me the feedback it did, and had the requisite approval.
We've been talking to a lot of guests about that process of readers' reports. It is often difficult, sometimes even painful, depending on what they write in them.
Yeah.
But maybe ultimately, and with some perspective, academic authors often have the feeling later, that actually probably really helped improve the book. I'm wondering if at this point, since the book has been out for a while, it's been a while since you were staring down those readers' reports for the first time, how you feel about what they might have done for your manuscript.
I mean, to be honest, they did not really have a great effect on the manuscript. There were some relatively small, or, I guess minor-y kinds of suggestions that made sense to me, and I tried to sort of incorporate. But it wasn't a case of, this, you should revise it in a sort of significant way and do X, Y, and Z. I had a couple of, with a couple of other presses that I think, if I understand the process correctly, operated slightly differently. Like there was a more initial review, maybe is the way to put it, by some outside folks. And I was getting a little bit more of that there. But at Cornell, that wasn't the case. So it was, I guess, a step that had to be gone through, but it didn't really influence the book very much.
Okay, and then that doesn't sound like a particularly painful experience, the kind of
it wasn't. Yeah. I guess in this case, for me, it wasn't.
Great.
Which I'm glad about, and right, that's lucky, I guess.
Some of our listeners might be wondering why they might be considering a trade division of an academic press. What's your sense of what you got, attention-wise, editorially, or from the marketing department that was different about going this way?
Yeah, well, I felt like I got a lot. It's hard for me to speak to how it's different, since this is my only experience, so I can't really compare it to a non-trade, unit or division of an academic press. And there was editorial review for sure. The person at Cornell who did that was great, and read it and had a lot of great suggestions, and many of which I did try to incorporate as best I could. So that, the editorial part of it was really excellent. The trade part of it, again, I have nothing to compare it to, so I can't speak to it that well. I mean, they certainly made an effort to get the word out to all kinds of reviewers, ranging from just in every media, from high to low. And I feel like they did a good job with that. And when some of that came, a little bit, not much, but some of that came from me, in the sense that I knew, for example, some legal publications that they would not ordinarily be familiar with, I don't think. And so when I would give them the heads up about sending it to X, Y, or Z legal publication or legal reviewer who wrote for a bar journal, let's say, something like that, they were always, they were quite responsive with that. Having said that, you would certainly know much more than I would, but I gather that in all walks of publishing, certainly even in commercial publishing, except for the very top sort of level of author who's already quite a known quantity, or perhaps has produced a book that the publishing house is so enthusiastic about that they're really counting on it. I mean, it sounds like that, except in cases like that, it almost always falls to the author to really publicize the book these days. And I assume that's true in the academic world, and it has mostly been true for me. And so that's what I've tried kind of haplessly as a non-publicist and a non-specialist to do.
Well, you did get a wonderful big New York Review of Books review by Linda Greenhouse, which I guess I'm just curious how that works. Did the press know that was going to happen and give you a heads up, or how did that end up?
The press did. That was an outlet where they told me right away there was interest when they pitched the book to that outlet. I didn't, as actually is referred to in the review itself, I had some prior contact with Linda Greenhouse, who was interviewed for the book and is quoted in the book because she's a journalist who back in the 1980s covered Judge Kaufman, and so I got to know him a little bit. So she was a good person to interview and provided some valuable stuff that's in the book. But I didn't know I didn't know she was reviewing it for the New York Review of Books. I had sent her a copy before, probably separately, entirely separately from whatever the press was doing when approaching outlets like the New York Review of Books. But I don't know. I have no idea how that review came about. In other words, I don't know if she took the copy I sent her and wanted to review it for them, or they approached her. I have no clue how that happened. So yeah. It was great to see, but the inner workings of it, I don't know.
One of the areas where I'm guessing it might be helpful to be in that trade division is the cost of the book. We've talked to some academic writers who've, worked to to try to urge the press to keep the price of their book kind of low. I'm wondering if maybe you didn't even need to do that, because in this part of Cornell, maybe that's sort of part of the deal, is you get it to actually be an affordable book.
Yeah, you're exactly right. That pressure was coming from them to me, and not the other way around. And that's, I gather, that a large element in that is just the length of it, obviously. And I'm someone who tends to overwrite. Maybe some of your listeners do too. And so that probably, in terms of all the kinds of editing that I did to produce the final book, that was the most challenging and most time consuming, was just to cut the length, which I recognized, was going to be good for all kinds of reasons. And one of them would be a more affordable or normal sort of price. And that pressure did come from them as well. So we kind of, so it was a happy convergence there, I guess.
And I don't remember, is it an under $30 book, or? Its
official cover price is around $35.
Okay, right, which is kind of normal now for those hardcover.
Yeah, I guess. Yeah, that's right. Yeah.
Okay, great. I wanted to talk to you too about just writing biography, which is something that many of our listeners are doing. You wrote about someone you actually knew. What were the challenges of approaching his life?
Yeah, well, there weren't challenges so much that way. And then I'll tell you the reason for that. It's because I worked for him at the very end of his life. I was really just there for about 6 months. And for 3 or so of those months, as I sort of detail at the very end of the book, he was ill. And so I actually got to know him. I got to know him a little bit, obviously, but less so than almost everyone else who worked for him in that capacity. And as the book also demonstrates, the folks who were his law clerks over the years had really strong opinions about him, because he was a difficult boss, and he just had a really distinctive personality. He was kind of a tough taskmaster. Could be warm and funny when he wanted to be, but he did drive his law clerks, and many of them came away from that experience without the best of impressions of him. A few came away and remained very close to him, with positive views. Almost all of them felt like at a minimum it had been good training. But I didn't really have those kinds of strong opinions one way or the other. So it's true that I knew him, and that's certainly what got me started on the book and what interested me about him. But I do think I was able to be, or I hope I was able to be, more objective than I think almost all other law clerks might have been, just for the reason that they knew him better and would have worked for him longer than I did.
Yeah, something about that, like your personally having a lack of strong feelings, did come through and sort of made it easier in a way, I think, for the reader to trust that you were sort of basing it on all the research you had done. Yeah,
and I'll say that it's funny, you were asking me before about the feedback from the outside reviewers, because there was some feedback to the effect of, we had initial concern that, and I got this from the press too, concern that it couldn't be objective because I was too close to, because someone who worked for him, it would be assumed, was too close to him and fond of him, and, would have viewed the relationship as a sort of mentor-mentee kind of relationship. So there was that concern there. And I think that's right. You kind of have to get into the manuscript a little bit to see that hopefully it doesn't come through much.
Yeah. Since we're recording during this Oppenheimer movie era, and we know it took decades for those writers to write that biography of Robert Oppenheimer. Yeah. And there were 2 of them at that. So I'm curious to hear how long you were at this, and whether there were stages of the writing of it and any time that you had to take away a significant time off from writing the biography.
Yes, absolutely. So I started this. I really wanted to start it, like the day after his funeral. And the book opens with his funeral, which was not the typical memorial service. It was disrupted by protesters. That's something that really caught my attention. It was so, unusual and shocking, and stayed with me. And after his death, I was sitting there kind of alone in his chambers. My co-clerk got reassigned almost immediately to another judge. So for weeks, I was just sitting there alone. I mean, his secretary also left shortly after. Eventually, a historian and archivist from the Library of Congress came in to start going through the papers. And, as they were headed out the door in boxes, I just wanted to stop, start working then and there. I just thought the guy was fascinating and worth a book. But I certainly couldn't do that. I needed, I couldn't just take the time off from that. I needed to get to work, and had a commitment to a law firm and all of that. I mean, I was 25, 26. So, it wasn't feasible and I'm not in academia. So it wasn't the kind of thing I was expecting to be doing or had the time to do. So I began working on it a couple of years later in 1994, when I had a couple of 3 months between jobs. And I just, the sort of desire to do it hadn't really left, and I had some free time, and I just began, doing some of the very early research that was going to be necessary. And then over the years, up until around 2015, 2016, I would work on it, in bits and pieces when I had a little time. If my legal practice was slower, if again, I was between one job or another, I did that thing that I bet a lot of your, guests and listeners try to do, because it is a good thing to try to do. I just couldn't keep it up, which is to wake up at 5 a.m. and try to write before my kids got up and before I had to take them to school. I kept that up for, a couple of months at best, probably. So I made a little bit of progress over the years. It was good that I did that because I was able to interview people in the early 2000s. His very first law clerks from the 1950s, including the one who was there for the Julius and Ethel Rosenberg trial, who I would not have had access to if I had not started this until, like I said, 2015 or 2016. So that was great. But in the end, I hadn't made all that much progress. And even though I'd taken a couple of research trips and, I don't know if you added up all the nights and weekends and mornings and, uninterrupted months or so between jobs, I don't know how much it would add up to, but I'd made a little bit of progress, but not that much. And I decided then that I just wasn't going to get anywhere unless I took time off to finish it. And I just kind of felt like I had to make a decision. Do I want to produce this or not? And it took a little bit of sacrifice in the sense that I had to stop working as a lawyer, and getting income. And, at that point in my career, I was fortunately able to do that somewhat. So from really 2016 through 2019, I was working on it pretty full time. And I needed to do that. I wouldn't have finished this otherwise. I really needed to do that. I'm also just the kind of person who, if I get diverted, I'm not, a lot of people are great at being able to do 3 things at once. And I'm not one of them. I found myself often when I would put it down and come back to it 9 months later, because I had a little time, I would just be reinventing the wheel. I was very bad at documenting where I'd left off, and what needed to be done next. So I'd have to spend days going back through old emails and figuring out had the FBI responded to this FOIA request that I sent 3 years ago? And if not, what do I do about it now? And I just was not getting anywhere, really. So that's what my process was like.
Yeah, I can't imagine psychologically and emotionally what it was like to carry that project with you for so long. Although I'm guessing since you were actually doing other work and had other projects going on in your career, and teaching, that you had other places to get some sort of work satisfaction from.
Yeah, very, very much so. I mean, this was a minor sideline that I didn't, it was in the back of my mind, but I didn't think about it much. Certainly not what I was focused on. And I wasn't ever sure I would finish it or could do it, or that it was doable. So it wasn't as if, well, I know I'm going to do this one day and I'll just kind of keep it going. It was more like, well, this is a kind of side project, and it would be really great if I could finally do it or turn it into something one day. So it required a sort of more calculated decision, I guess, ultimately, that, okay, there's enough here, and I've done enough to where I can kind of see how to do it maybe. And this is what I'm going to do. It's worth taking the time off for this and diverting my career and, dipping into the savings a little bit and getting it done.
Yeah. And actually, many academics are with a project this long, and it kind of is their main work. So I'm guessing in some ways it might have felt almost life-changing to have it then be out, or as it was, going into production. What has this been like now to have it out in the world?
Yeah, that's been great. And again, I know your listeners who've published and the ones who are on the verge of publishing and thinking about what it's going to be like when they publish, have experienced this or will. It is great. It's really satisfying. I mean, I think, the day when the box arrived and there were actual books, not long PDFs, not drafts, not documents into which you could insert edits, but here it is. It's in a book, and you've seen the picture of the cover in an email attachment, but to hold it, that's pretty remarkable and really satisfying. I'll tell you also, just on a personal note, my dad, and I'm sure this was a large part of the impetus to do this book. My dad was a history professor. He taught at the University of Houston for 51 years. And I talked to him about this book over the years, and he'd been very encouraging. So that was just an extra level of satisfaction to be able to actually get it and show it to him. And you could see, for years, I kind of felt like I'm talking to him about this book, but I'm not really doing it. And he's going to think I'm, just full of hot air, to actually completed it, on that level, to have something to hand to him. It was the very end of his life. He died a few months later. It was really, really gratifying.
I bet. Yeah. We've talked with a lot of guests about writing communities, writing groups, friends and colleagues people send work to. Not everyone has this kind of writing community, and maybe not everyone even wants it. But I'm curious if that was part of your process. What kind of readers, if any, did you have of your work as you went?
Yeah, well, no. I mean, I think that would be great, and I didn't have it, and I probably should have sought it out in some way. I'm not sure how I could have achieved it exactly. I could see how it's maybe more readily accessible in academia. I, for years and years, was just sort of sitting here, like doing it alone. And it's also, again, in academia, you're expected to produce books. I feel like when I would tell people I'm doing this, you'd get a sort of curious and sometimes interested or sometimes not response, but it's a bit odd. Eventually I had a friend say something to me like, does anybody else do this? Like, this is the thing, that you can do? Like, anyone else doing this? So, and I said, no. So I didn't really have a writer's community, which I think I would have benefited from along the way, to be asking, questions to and getting feedback from. It wasn't until really shortly before publication, which is to say after review, certainly by those outside folks, after acceptance of the manuscript from Cornell, possibly, I don't know if it was after their edits, maybe right before or at the same time the editor there was doing some edits. I did at that point finally send it to a couple of friends of mine because I was looking for a very specific kind of feedback, which Cornell had not provided actually. Their outside reviewers had been historians, but they had not sent it to a law professor. And I felt like that's a gap, I thought, because there's doctrine in the book, there's legal history in the book, aside from just political history or Cold War history or social history, and I wanted someone's feedback on that. And so I've got a friend who's a law professor at University of Akron Law School. She read it. And I have another friend who's not a law professor. He's a professor of European history, but he had been a lawyer. I was an old law school friend of mine. So I knew he would bring something a little different to it than just a non-lawyer historian. So those are the only outside readers, and my dad, although by then he couldn't, that this was a manuscript, and by then he couldn't really comment much. But I wish along the way I'd had that, and that's a great question.
Yeah, I mean, sometimes the spouse or parent who's just interested in reading is part of what gets us to sort of write more, so that can be pretty helpful too.
And I'm glad you said that, because I should credit my spouse. She did read. She's a former lawyer. Now hasn't practiced for many years, but a great writer in her own right, and she's published a book herself, and she did read the manuscript even probably before it went to Cornell. So yeah, I did have that, but I took her question really to mean, as I'm researching, as I'm doing initial writing, would it have been good to have a community of people doing something similar so I could bounce ideas off of? And yeah, I think it would have been.
Your writing style is great, as I mentioned. And so I'm curious, for academics, this is often a difficult thing to get back to or get to writing in such a clear, non-jargony way. Did this come naturally for you, or how did you accomplish it?
Well, right. I mean, I don't have that background in academic writing. So whatever the sort of good of that, and if there's any bad, the bad of that, were just the kind of habits or whatever the features of that are. I didn't have at the outset. So I was always looking to write something kind of accessible to really just to non-lawyers, just to educated readers, period. And I've done a fair amount of writing, certainly not the length of the book, but I've done a fair amount of writing on legal topics, some of it for non-lawyers, op-ed pieces, things of that nature. So I had a little bit of experience with it. And I'll say the trend, and this has been long running now among legal writers, meaning not necessarily the legal academy, but lawyers writing for judges. There's long been a push, at least 30 years or so, to sort of de-jargonize that. There's a lot of, there's a ton of legal jargon. It's got its own set of, expressions in Latin and language, all unique to lawyers, just like any other field. And there's been a push to try to have more accessible writing and more flair in that writing, more entertaining writing, just even when you're writing a legal brief on almost any topic. So I think I've imbibed some of that. I think that's mostly been for the good when it comes to law practice also.
One of the challenges you might have been dealing with that will be familiar to many academic listeners is that you had a figure, Judge Kaufman, who doesn't have a household name, like a recognizable name. He doesn't have that kind of celebrity or name recognition, I guess is what I meant to say. So how did you sort of overcome that or deal with the challenge of letting readers know this is someone important?
Yeah, that's a really good question. But someone very recently said to me, I can't remember who it was, but someone said to me, this is the only biography I've ever seen where the name of the subject is not in the title or the subtitle. And I hadn't thought about that. I guess that's true. That would be sort of rare. His lack of being, a household name, even a household name for lawyers outside of New York, at least, was a real hurdle. It was a real conundrum. And the obvious way to solve it, and I feel like in the end, the way it was addressed, in a way in which I'm not totally happy, is to lean on the Rosenbergs because everyone's heard of that case. And that's what he's famous for. And so that their name does appear in the subtitle. It's obviously a famous incident in American history and certainly in American legal history. So that becomes the hook. The reason I don't really love that, although I concede it's sort of necessary, is that I didn't really set out to write a book about the Rosenberg case. And the reason I didn't set out to write a book about the Rosenberg case is that we already have a lot of them. There are good books about that case. There's very little new to say about it. So much so that I ran across a journal article, and I don't remember where it was published, but the title of the article literally was, "Is there anything new to say about the Rosenberg case?" And I was reviewing another book from years ago or maybe commenting on some other article. I don't know why that was the title of it, but I agree, there isn't much new to say about the case. I wanted to write about him, and I wanted to write about more than the Rosenberg case. I wanted to write about the rest of his career. He handled all these other famous and important cases that aren't as closely associated with him, but were important, both just in American history generally and more so in legal history. And to the degree, obviously, I knew I'd be covering the Rosenberg case at length. To the degree I was doing that, I wanted to show how it affected him personally, since I knew that had been dramatic. I wanted to show how it affected his later work and his jurisprudence. And I wanted to examine the case. I thought maybe the only sense in which the case, there was something, if not new, at least different to say about the case, was to do so more from a legal angle. The major books about the Rosenbergs have not been written by lawyers, and they don't focus on the performance of the judge. They naturally focus on, was the couple guilty? What was the evidence? What was the nature of Soviet espionage? Topics like that, of course, are understandable. I wanted to approach it as a lawyer and look at the trial and look at what were the legal factors? What was in his head when he sentenced them? So that's maybe, that's a slightly different perspective anyway. But more than that, I didn't really want to write a Rosenberg book. But then to come back to your question, if he had not been if he hadn't handled that case, he would not really be worth a book. And which is why, as the Greenhouse says in that review, there aren't many biographies of judges below the level of the Supreme Court. So it was the case that made him worth a book, and yet sort of I wanted to write about other stuff. So I don't know if I've solved it, the puzzle you begin your question with, but those are the factors.
Yeah, I was also really taken with your chapters. They're I think pretty short, although I think that's actually just the trend in especially things that are trade press. I personally prefer that, and I know a lot of my academic friends want to move towards that too, shorter chapters. I also loved the table of contents. The chapter titles were very evocative. I often do look at a table of contents when I'm sort of thinking of buying a book, and it's telling me the story of the book there, and I felt like I was getting the feel of this life and the chapters and the content from your table of contents instead of it being sort of dry, those straightforward chapter titles we sometimes use in academia. Did that just sort of come naturally to you, or what made you go that way?
Yeah, I mean, again, it really was the goal to get lay readers. Mm-hmm. So, and I guess, that kind of popular history that I'm familiar with and have been reading all my life, and narrative nonfiction, that's employed there. So that's the world I'm much more familiar with. Not that I don't read stuff from university presses, but I think largely I was probably just imitating, what I'm more comfortable with, in my own reading and my own sort of personal history.
Yeah, so I guess you answered another question there, which is about sort of what you've read that has influenced you. And I wonder if you could tell us about just some authors or titles of sort of popular history.
Yeah, well, I mean, I guess in the world of, biography, there's like, Cairo and then there's most everybody else. So, which is not fair. There are, of course, tremendous biographies written by lots of great biographers. I am a huge sort of Cairo fan, and that's influential. Manchester, certainly. Read a great, probably the best judicial biography I've read not long ago. It was for this class I'm on. It was a biography of Justice Harlan, the first Harlan. And I'm embarrassed to say I've got to look up at my bookshelf to remind me who the author was. It's Peter Canellis, who, if I'm remembering correctly, had been a writer for the Boston Globe. I think I have that right. I was a journalist, was his background. And that's, that doing something very similar to what I try to do in mine, which is to, tell the story of a life in the law, make these cases accessible because, they're about things that really affect our everyday lives, and that had a historical impact, and try to show the person. That's something that's often, I won't say it's missing from academic analyses, but as you would expect, it sometimes gets short shrift when you're looking at, in the legal world anyway, when you're looking at somebody's jurisprudence, you tend to focus on the output more than the personality of the person involved. And yet I think really in, very much so in Kaufman's case, his personality, I think, dictated a lot of what he did from 9 to 5 and a lot of the paper that flowed out of his office into the case books. That it's not just the ideas there, or the legal arguments. It's you can see him sort of on the page, his feverish personality, his hyperactivity. That's part of what made him, it's now pejorative, but what we would call an activist judge, because he was an activist everything. And so when found in the judiciary, when he landed in the judiciary, that's what he would be. So, and that's not just due to ideas or philosophies, it's due to his inner constitution, I thought,
mm-hmm. Has this process with book one made you want to write another book? And is biography something you'd consider, if so?
Yeah, absolutely. I love biography. It's just easy, like it provides this natural framework, and there's a kind of pole star you can keep, your North Star that you're focused on, even if there are digressions and you're bringing in wider history or social developments. It kind of ultimately keeps the story focused. So it's easy in that way. And I do really like the form and always have. I'd love to write another book. I don't know sure what it'll be about, and not sure I'll get the sort of freedom to do that and the time to do that. But I hope so. Yeah, I'd love to.
I was talking to a friend recently about biography because I am also working on one, and this friend said, I can't imagine being responsible for the telling of another person's life story, and that's just a responsibility I don't want. I feel some of that, not enough to make me not want to do biography, but I wonder what you think about that comment.
I think that comment shows incredible insight from someone, less so from an actual biographer, someone who's immersed in it, that thought will occur to them. Mm-hmm. But to have that thought, as a non-biographer, I think really is insightful. I absolutely felt that and feel that. Even more so, I think, as I approached the end and it kind of had taken shape and I could kind of see what it was. Right, because you want desperately, you just think you've got to do justice, to this person, and you want to get every facet of them sort of represented, and yet not get lost in the weeds. Have a kind of whole picture. And in the end, having spent all the time I spent on it and written what I've written, of course, I hope I got it right. But there's so much you just can't know. There's so much you don't know. You're limited to what they happen to put down on paper. You may be overreading, remarks here and there, giving them greater significance than they really deserve. It is a lot of, I feel that it is a lot of responsibility. And in the end, what is it? It's just the best, hopefully, faithfully objective representation this writer could come up and researcher could come up with. That's the best you could say for it, right? It's not really that person because we can't really get that. I think I'm used to that a little bit. I think in those terms a little bit as a lawyer, because, if you try a case, it isn't, is it truth, that you've presented in court, or is it's just witnesses' recollections, right? Long after the facts, it's just whatever they remember about an episode or incident. And that's what becomes the kind of quote unquote truth. But, is that really what happened? Is that the complete story? That I feel the same, more so with biography. It is a big responsibility.
Yeah. What you said about dealing with what they've written or not written, the silences in their archive. I'm thinking of that with Judge Kaufman. When I was reading your biography, I was thinking how much anti-Semitism probably informed kind of a lot of his personality, which I guess I tend to think is true for so many Jews who were living during the first half of the 20th century. And you usually can't find them writing about anti-Semitism. Right. Their letters might never include that word, but it seems like it's usually sort of deep in there, embedded inside of them. And I wonder how you dealt with that issue with him.
Yeah, that's been a focus of analysis in the Rosenberg case for a long time. So I certainly went into it thinking about that and wondering to what degree was his decision in that case or his behavior in that case influenced by his Judaism, by his cultural Jewishness. Would he have looked at them differently than certain other judges? As I say in the book, I think he did. But you're absolutely right. That's nowhere really that I can think of just here offhand in his papers. And he had a life, as far as I can tell, that wasn't terribly marred by anti-Semitism at the same time that it was all around him. Like it would have been the case that when he graduated law school, he suffered from the same job discrimination that all Jewish law graduates did at the time. Large established firms wouldn't take them. They were limited to solo practices or very small outfits, usually run by other Jewish lawyers. So that would have been a really ever-present sort of part of his reality. And yet there's certainly no complaint I found about that anywhere, no hint of recognition. He was unusual in the sense that he went to Fordham. Most Jews in New York looking for a free or low-cost education went to CCNY. So he was educated in this kind of Catholic environment, even though lots of Jewish students there. It's not as if he was the lone Jewish student, but the tenor of the school and some of the curriculum was, directly Catholic. And yeah, I think it was there, but subsumed. The reference to it, I found that this is one of those things, like, am I overreading it? But it really was interesting to me and telling was this letter that I quote at the end of the chapter on the Rosenberg sentencing from his wife, not a letter, just a card to him. And she says, it begins, don't let the commies get you down. We all, we the family, we all love and admire you. And she says in that short note of only 3 or 4 sentences, where could we go from here? And that I thought really was meaningful to me. Where could we go for this sense of Jewish insecurity? We're here. we have this is a home. We have nowhere to go. For Irving Kaufman, it was a great home. But as I say in the book, I find it impossible to believe that kind of attitude didn't color his view of the Rosenbergs and how he ultimately responded to their what he saw as their betrayal of the United States.
Yeah, that letter was incredible. They were probably sort of the 1% of American Jews anyway, living on Park Avenue.
Yeah.
She was coming from money and privilege. And yet
Yeah.
she felt that too, that line almost seemed sort of eerie because the rest of the letter was kind of cheery, like, the cheerleader wife cheering you on. But
Yeah.
underneath there is that insecurity.
Yeah, I felt exactly. It just jumped off the page. That kind of tension and fear and possible recognition or sense of non-belonging,
Mm-hmm.
that was always over the horizon or under the surface or something. And if you read his remarks at sentencing, especially when he put them in writing about a year or so later in December of 1952, when he issued an opinion denying their request for a modification of the sentence, he has a few lines like the defendants were, raised in this country, reared on our institutions, educated. And I mean, you can feel this sense of personal betrayal there because he had done so well. Why would anybody of any background akin to his, and they all started in the same place. Why would anyone do what the Rosenbergs did? That's what he could never really come to grips with, I think.
Yeah. He had some of that like American Jewish exceptionalism feeling,
Yeah.
Even as alongside that kind of ambient anti-Semitism that sort of shaped everything. One thing we've been asking all guests is, what is something you wish you had known about writing earlier in your career, writing or publishing?
Wow. I wish I'd known. Well, I didn't know anything really. I didn't know. Like I said before, I knew next to nothing about the process of publication. So the main thing I didn't know is, would this get published? Because I said I started working on this in '94 and would devote little bits of time to it over the years. And even in 2015, 2016, when I set aside, sort of my daily work life to do this, I didn't know if it would get published. I didn't talk to anyone in the publishing world. Wouldn't have had anyone to talk to, really, that I knew. And ultimately what I mean by that is I wrote the whole thing. So I didn't, do a proposal and a chapter and send that off and see what the reaction to it was. I wrote the whole thing. And one reason I did that is because I felt like if I tried to like just do some bit of it to see if it would get published, and I began getting negative reactions, I would probably stop. In other words, I felt like the only way I could make myself really do it and commit to it was to do it, and not only do it if I thought it was going to get published or if someone was telling me it was going to get published or what. So there was an awfully nervous moment that I'm sure you probably covered with some of the folks you've interviewed right around 2020 in the pandemic, because that was when I was getting, sort of the door to maybe publishing with a commercial press was closing, and I had to, learn about and approach university presses. That was right in February, March 2020, when there was all this dire writing about, are universities how many colleges and universities are going to be keeping their doors open for the next couple of years, let alone will they have the resources or time and attention for something like a university press. So, I was awfully unsure and anxious about whether, now that I was turning to university presses, would they publish anything, would they just pause all projects or publish anything? And at that point, the manuscript was almost all done. And I sort of felt like I was going to face the embarrassment of having to tell people who I've been telling for years I'm working on this book that it just wasn't going to get published. So I don't know if that doesn't quite answer the what do I wish I'd known before. But
well, part of what's interesting there is some folks we've spoken to have mentioned that they did, if they were thinking they might go trade press or even trade press division, that they did the proposal and then waited to hear. So I'm wondering, is part of what you're saying that in the future, if you're thinking trade, you might try that, or is it personally that it works better for you to just write the whole manuscript?
I mean, it definitely worked better for me. I might try that the second time around. I think I'd feel more secure about it. I know the process much more now. Maybe rejection on that front wouldn't be as discouraging as I kind of was thinking it would be the first time around. So yeah, I could see doing that. But of course, the downside of that is, and I'd love to talk to people who do that, because they're I think better writers and thinkers than I am, maybe, because your proposal and even maybe that chapter possibly is so shaped by the later stages of your work. I think it's much easier. In a way, it's more time consuming and maybe ultimately fruitless if it doesn't get published, but it's easier to do what I did, because if you've written almost all of it before you do the proposal, you really kind of know what it is.
Right.
I can't really I've read, a couple of friends have sent, at least one friend has sent a proposal which misguidedly, because I don't know what I'm doing, but this person, since I published a book, this person sent me a proposal and just wanted my feedback on the proposal. And I felt like from the proposal that author wasn't completely sure, what he was doing, and that's because they probably weren't far enough along on the project exactly. Mm-hmm. So that's one upside of doing it the way I did, is what it is anyway. And that's got to make for a better proposal and maybe a more cohesive chapter. You also probably have your best chapter because you've written most of them, by then.
Yeah, no, I know what you mean. This seems like a paradox. How can you do this great proposal when you're not far enough into the project to really be steeped in it and know what it is?
I guess there's a sweet spot there for authors who really know what they're doing. They've done enough and they can produce the proposal. For me, I was almost all done by the time I mean, not all. I guess I had a couple chapters left, but I was mostly done.
Another question we've been asking folks is if there is a writing practice or habit that has been working for you.
Well, I just approached it, when I set aside time to do this full time, I had to approach it the way I approach working as a lawyer. So that just means, I kept the same hours. And a lot of what I do, really most of what I do as a lawyer is research and write. I'm the kind of lawyer, I'm an appellate lawyer. Most of what we do is produce written briefs. I'm not in court very much. I'm not meeting with clients very much. So my job already was kind of sitting here and researching and writing. So it wasn't all that big a difference to be doing this, especially since it's legal writing to some degree or writing about law. So that was what worked for me was keeping to the very same, schedule and habits of other kinds of work. And probably when I was trying to do it in bits and pieces and therefore wasn't doing that probably accounted for some of the difficulty I had stopping and starting that way, because I was I was sort of at loose ends. Much easier. I mean, it's a luxury, but much easier if you can, this is my job. It's what I'm doing every day. I'm working on this book, just like I would be working on a brief, just like I'd be working on an article. I'm going to sit here and research and write. That was, productive and successful for me.
Did that mean you were writing from 9 to 5 or?
Yeah, well, I mean, that's another thing. I would try to think. I would research and write as I went along. In other words, I did not complete all the research and then sit down to do all the writing. So there were times when that time was spent reading or researching or whatever. But yeah, when I was sitting in front of the computer, I was writing and sure. I mean, just like writing a brief, which for me can take 2 or 3 weeks at a time, longer depending on the complexity. That's what I was doing here.
Well, thank you so much, Martin. This has been really interesting. And I know our listeners will appreciate hearing about writing this biography. So thanks for taking the time to speak with us.
Absolutely. Thanks so much. I really appreciate it.
Thanks for listening to Writing It, the podcast about academics and writing, sponsored by the Center for Jewish Studies at the University of Florida. Visit our podcast description to find out how to contact us and send us your questions about academic writing and publishing. Follow us on social media at Writing It Pod and subscribe to us so you never miss an episode.